Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, you and I are journeying way back in time to the Triassic period. We're going to explore Azendohsaurus.
Right, an extinct reptile whose story is actually full of twists and turns.
Exactly. We've got a collection of research here covering, well, everything from its first discovery to what it looked like, the environments it lived in.
Yeah, all that stuff.
Our mission today is to really dig into what makes this creature so interesting and, what it tells us about the history of life.
And what makes Azendosaurus so compelling, I think, is the initial confusion around it. Imagine thinking you found one of the very earliest dinosaurs, a plant eater.
Yeah.
That was the first idea. Then the thinking shifted, and people thought maybe it was an early cousin of the giant sauropods, a so-called prosauropod.
Okay.
But the real aha moment, that came later with discoveries that just completely rewrote its family history. It's a great story.
It really is. And we're talking about two species here. Azendosaurus larusi from Morocco and Azendosaurus madagascarensis from Madagascar.
Right, living roughly between, 247 and 201 million years ago, middle to late Triassic.
Yeah. And even the name Azendo lizard, named after a village near where they first found it in Morocco, it kind of hints at this long, winding scientific journey. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. How did this puzzle first come to light?
Well, the story kicks off in 1972. Jean-Michel Dutuit found some fossils in Morocco, just some bits of jaw and teeth, really.
Okay, not much to go on.
Not a lot. But based on those, he classified Azendosaurus larusi as a herbivorous ornithischian dinosaur. The group like Stegosaurus, Triceratops.
Okay, so finding one that early would have been huge,
Yeah.
right? Suggesting herbivorous dinosaurs were around much earlier than thought.
Exactly, a really significant claim. But that classification didn't stick for long.
It didn't. What happened?
Well, just a couple of years later, other paleontologists, folks like Richard Thulborn and Jose Bonaparte, they looked at the Moroccan stuff. And they argued, no, this looks more like a prosauropod. Those early relatives, the giant long necks, like Brontosaurus.
Okay, so still a dinosaur, but a different branch entirely.
Sort of. We now know prosauropods aren't really a neat single group like we used to think. But the key idea then was, okay, it's probably closer to the sauropod line. And this view started to catch on. Even due to it, the original discoverer eventually came around to that idea.
Wow, so quite a shift from a potential early stego relative to maybe a bronto ancestor.
Yeah.
Based on just jaws and teeth. But the story didn't end there either, did it?
No, not quite. Fast forward to 1993. François-Xavier Goffert re-examined the Moroccan material. He agreed, okay, it's all one type of animal and, yeah, probably not an ornithischian.
Right.
He still put it in Prosauropoda, but kind of tentatively inserted Sadis, meaning its exact spot was uncertain. Because while the jaws and teeth had some similarities to early plant-eating dinos and prosauropods, there just weren't enough other Triassic reptiles known at the time to compare it to properly. So it was this, intriguing but kind of isolated puzzle piece.
An evolutionary enigma for decades. Just this maybe early sauropod relative floating around. And then Madagascar. This is where things get really interesting, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. This is the game changer. Between 1997 and 1999, researchers hit this incredible bone bed in southwestern Madagascar.
A bone bed.
Yeah.
Like lots of fossils together.
Exactly, in the Mackay Formation. And it yielded an almost complete picture of a new Azendosaurus species. What's amazing is they found remains of about a dozen individuals, different ages, different sizes.
Wow. From just jaw bits to a dozen individuals. That's like paleontological gold.
It really was. It gave us so much more information than those few Moroccan fragments ever could.
I bet. So much more detail.
Totally. Though, interestingly, even with all this great new material, there was a small hiccup at first. Based on some slight differences in tooth shape between the upper and lower jaws in the Madagascar finds, some researchers initially thought they might have two different prosauropod species there.
Ah, the teeth causing confusion again.
Yeah, exactly. One of which seemed a bit like the Moroccan A. larusi. It just shows how subtle differences can sometimes point you in the wrong direction initially, especially with teeth.
It really highlights why finding more complete skeletons is so crucial, doesn't it?
Absolutely. But more digging, more analysis, it eventually showed all the Madagascar fossils belonged to just one new species, Azendosaurus madagascarensis.
Okay.
It was officially described in 2010 by John Flynn and his team, and here's the kicker.
Yeah.
This was the first published research that definitively stated Azendosaurus was not a dinosaur at all.
Whoa. The big reveal. So after all that time being shuffled around the dinosaur family tree, it turns out it wasn't even in the club.
Exactly. It was something else entirely.
So what did those more complete skeletons from Madagascar actually show? Where did it fit?
They were revolutionary. They revealed a whole bunch of features all through the skeleton that were clearly more primitive than what you see in dinosaurs, more ancestral traits.
Okay.
These characteristics placed Azendohsaurus further down the family tree in a more basal position within a larger group called Archosauromorpha.
Archosauromorpha. So that includes dinosaurs, but also their earlier relatives and other reptile groups that branched off before them.
Precisely. It was seeing these more ancient traits combined with the jaw and teeth features that finally made scientists realize those similarities to sauropodomorphs. That wasn't close family, that was convergent evolution. Something we definitely need to talk more about.
Absolutely. But first, let's paint a picture. Now that we have A. madagascarensis giving us a much better look, what kind of animal are we talking about here?
Okay, picture a pretty sturdy four-legged reptile, maybe somewhere around 6 to 10 feet long, maybe a bit longer in some cases.
Okay, decent size.
Yeah, and one thing you would notice is its tail was actually pretty short for an archosaur. We estimate maybe 45 to 55 tail vertebrae.
Shorter tail, okay. What about its stance?
It had pretty robust limbs. The back legs were likely held in a somewhat sprawling posture, a bit like a modern lizard.
Right.
But the front legs might have been held a bit more upright, slightly elevated. It also had a fairly long neck for its body size, supporting a head that was proportionately kind of small and almost boxy.
So not exactly built for speed. More solid, maybe a bit slow. And those jaws and teeth, the ones that caused all the dinosaur confusion, what were those key features?
Yeah, the resemblance, especially in the jaw, was striking. The lower jaw had this noticeable downward curve right at the tip, just like you see in many sauropods.
Okay.
And the teeth were leaf-shaped, lanceolate is the technical term,
Sure.
broad crowns, sort of bulbous bases, and they were fused directly to the jawbone. That's called ankylithecodon teeth.
Fused to the bone, like no distinct roots.
Pretty much. Grown right into the jaw. Very different from our teeth.
And leaf-shaped teeth scream plant eater, right?
Right.
But you mentioned heterodont dentition, meaning different kinds of teeth.
Exactly. The teeth in the upper and lower jaws weren't the same. The upper teeth were generally shorter, broader, with maybe 4 to 6 little serrations or denticles.
Okay.
The lower teeth, they were much taller and had about twice as many denticles. These lower teeth looked really similar to early sauropodomorph teeth.
Ah, okay. I see the confusion now.
Yeah. And interestingly, the teeth right at the very front of the upper jaw, the premaxilla, they were the longest and most curved. So different shapes likely meant different jobs in grabbing and processing plants.
A specialized toolkit for munching Triassic greens. But there was something else really weird about its mouth, too. Palatal teeth.
You mean like on the roof of its mouth?
You got it.
Yeah.
And not just a few.
Yeah.
Azendosaurus had tons of fully developed teeth on its palate, up to 4 sets on one bone, the pterygoid, plus more rows on other palate bones.
Wow.
A mature A. madagascarensis might have had dozens of these extra teeth, and what's really wild is that they looked almost identical to the main jaw teeth, just maybe a bit chunkier.
That's incredible. Most reptiles don't have anything like that, do they? Some early reptiles had palatal teeth, yeah, but the sheer number and how similar they were to the main teeth in Azendosaurus is pretty exceptional. It strongly suggests they were actively used in processing food.
Just sounds like a vegetation shredding machine.
Hmm.
Now, comparing the two species, the Moroccan A. larousi and the Madagascar A. madagascarensis, you mentioned some subtle differences.
Yeah, mostly in the teeth and jaws, based on what we have. A. larousi generally had a few more teeth in its upper jaw, maybe 15 or 16, compared to 11 to 13 in A. madagascarensis.
Okay.
The Moroccan species' teeth also seem a bit taller, maybe with more tightly packed serrations. And there was this bony ridge on the inside of the upper jaw.
A ridge.
Yeah, prominent keel. In A. larousi, it ran the whole length of the maxilla, the main upper jawbone. In A. madagascarensis, it was only on the back half. Little details like that.
Interesting. But without more bones from Morocco, it's hard to know if there were other big differences.
Exactly. The Madagascar fossils really gave us the main blueprint for the whole animal.
Right. So let's dig into that blueprint more. What about the rest of the skeleton? The backbone, for instance.
The vertebral column of A. madagascarensis is pretty well known. We think it had about 24 vertebrae before the hips, the presacrals. The sacrum itself, connecting to the hips, was just 2 fused vertebrae.
Only 2. That seems low for a reptile that size.
It is relatively few compared to many later archosaurs, yeah. And as we said, the tail was pretty short. The neck vertebrae changed shape quite a bit longer, with low spines near the head, getting shorter but with taller spines closer to the body.
Okay.
The back vertebrae were generally similar to the last neck ones, and the very last one, before the hip, had this distinct forward-pointing spine. Then the tail vertebrae had backward-pointing spines that got smaller further down the tail.
Gotcha. And the ribs. You suggested it might have been quite wide-bodied.
Seems like it. The neck ribs were long and thin, maybe even overlapping in places to stiffen the neck a bit.
Right.
But the ribs on the torso, they were long and really curved outwards. That definitely suggests a wide, deep, kind of barrel-shaped chest. Interestingly, we've only found one set of gastralia belly ribs. They were quite delicate, which suggests Azendosaurus maybe didn't have that extensive belly rib basket you see in some other early reptiles.
Fascinating. Okay, moving to the limbs and how they attach the girdles. What did the shoulder and hip regions look like, and how does that tie into this semi-sprawled idea?
Well, the shoulder blade, the scapula, was long and curved, fitting against that barrel chest. There's a bone in the chest, the interclavicle, which was pretty big and had some unique bumps and projections on it. The other shoulder bones, the coracoids, were large and rounded. They formed a shoulder socket, the glenoid, that faced mostly outwards, typical for a more sprawling posture.
But you said the front limbs might have been a bit more upright.
Yeah, there's a subtle hint. The part of the socket formed by the shoulder blade itself seems angled slightly backward. This might mean the upper arm bone, the humerus, was held maybe not fully sprawled, but slightly raised. The arm bones themselves were pretty stout, robust, with expanded ends.
Okay, and the hips and hind legs, that's where the sprawling stance was more obvious.
Seems so. The hip bones, ilium, pubis, ischium, were all roughly similar in size. The ilium was tall and curved. The pubis pointed down and a bit forward. The ischium was shorter, triangular.
And a hip socket.
Deep and rounded, importantly with a solid inner wall. Dinosaurs, in contrast, have an open hip socket. That's a key difference.
Ah, okay.
And the thigh bone, the femur, long, slightly S-shaped, but crucially, the head didn't turn inwards like a dinosaur femur head does. That lack of an inward turn strongly indicates a less upright, more sprawling posture for the hind limbs. The shaft was also twisted, another sign of a sprawling gait.
Right, so the back legs were definitely more lizard-like in posture.
Yeah, that seems the most likely interpretation. The lower leg bones, tibia and fibula, were also pretty robust.
And what about the hands and feet? Any clues there about lifestyle?
We actually have complete hands and feet, which is fantastic. The wrist and ankle bones were well ossified. The hand is interesting, the palm bones, the metacarpals, spread out in a nice arc, and the fingers were almost symmetrical around the middle one. That's a bit unusual.
Okay.
The foot also had diverging bones, the metatarsals, but it wasn't symmetrical. The fourth toe was quite long, and the fifth toe was short and kind of hooked.
The real surprise was the claws, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah. The claws were huge on both hands and feet. Very large, quite narrow, sharply curved, actually bigger than the finger or toe bone they attached to.
Bigger than the bone. Wow.
Yeah. And they share some features with the claws of theropod dinosaurs and the meat eaters and also early turtles, which has led to this really interesting idea. Maybe they were adapted for digging?
Digging claws. On this bulky plant-eating reptile. That's unexpected.
Totally unexpected. It adds another layer of weirdness, doesn't it?
It really does. So, okay, these amazing Madagascar skeletons completely changed the game. How did they lead to redefining its place on the reptile family tree?
Well, with all that detailed anatomy, it became crystal clear Azendosaurus wasn't a dinosaur. It belonged to a more primitive group within that big Archosauromorph branch.
Right.
And this realization led to placing it in a whole new group, recognized relatively recently, called Alootosauria.
Alootosauria, what does that mean?
It means strange reptiles.
Yeah. Seems appropriate.
Doesn't it? It's a group of mostly herbivorous Archosauromorphs that have some really specialized jaws and teeth, and also this odd mix of some features that seem like evolutionary reversals back to older traits alongside their own unique specializations.
A club for the weirdos of the Triassic reptile world. And Azendosaurus is a key member.
It's the namesake. It defines its own family within that group, Azendosauridae. For a while, it was the only member known.
Okay.
But now, with more finds and analysis, other similar strange reptiles have been added. The most famous is probably Shringosaurus from India, bigger, had horns, also a herbivore, described in 2017.
Horns too. Wow.
Yeah. And some studies suggest another Indian reptile, Pamelaria, might be a more basal Azendosaurid. But the key thing is that the two Azendosaurus species, Laroussier madagascarensis, are definitely very closely related within this family.
So, Azendosaurus found its true family among the strange reptiles. What are the key things that link these Alacotosaurs, and what makes Azendosaurus still stand out?
While many Alacotosaurs share those specialized jaws and teeth we talked about and that mix of primitive and derived features, but there's actually quite a bit of variety, especially in heads and teeth.
Right.
For example, some other Alacotosaurs, like the Trilophosaurids, had beak-like mouths. Azendosaurus, though, kept those compressed serrated teeth along the jaw edges.
Okay.
But features linking the Azendosauridae family specifically include things like having the nostril openings kind of merge into one, those leaf-shaped teeth, and a relatively long neck. Azendosaurus itself is distinguished by things like that groove inside its upper jaw and the really expanded tooth crowns.
Gotcha. And the latest studies support this placement.
Yeah, phylogenetic analyses, the studies that map out evolutionary relationships, consistently group these animals together. Recent work often puts Azendosaurus as a very close relative, a sister taxon, to Shringosaurus, and that pair is closely related to other Alacotosaurs like Malorosaurus and Pamelaria. The picture is becoming clearer.
And it's amazing how science refines these family trees over time. Now let's circle back to that convergent evolution you mentioned, the similarities with sauropodomorph dinosaurs. Just how extensive was this independent evolution of similar traits?
It's honestly remarkable. We're talking about features in the jaws, the teeth, even some skeletal bits that evolved independently in the Azendosaurus and in the early relatives of sauropods.
And these weren't trivial similarities.
No, not at all. Some traits, like those leaf-shaped teeth and the downturned jaw tip, were once considered hallmarks, like defining features of sauropodomorphs, proof of their ancestry. The fact that Azendosaurus, on a completely different evolutionary branch, developed these same features likely for eating similar types of plants just shows how powerful natural selection can be. Similar problems, similar solutions, even in unrelated groups.
Evolution hitting on the same idea twice. And you mentioned the pattern was a bit unusual, focused on the front half.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. The convergence, the similarities with sauropodomorphs, is strongest in the head, the neck, the front part of the body.
But the back half?
The back half stayed more primitive. Those sprawling hind legs, the relatively short tail, those are more typical of earlier Archosauromorphs, very different from the upright back legs and often super long tails of sauropodomorphs.
So it's like it bolted a sauropod front end onto a more primitive reptile chassis.
Huh. That's one way to put it. It's a great example of mosaic evolution. Different parts of the body evolving at different rates or in different directions.
And the timing is also key here, right? Azendosaurus lived alongside the earliest sauropodomorphs, but resembled later ones in some ways.
Exactly. It was around at the same time as the first known sauropodomorphs, which were mostly smaller, probably bipedal animals.
Well,
But Azendosaurus, with its bulk and its neck and teeth adaptations, already showed features similar to later, larger sauropodomorphs. This has led to the idea that maybe Azendosaurids, like Azendosaurus, were actually among the first large, high-browsing herbivores in these Triassic ecosystems.
so they might have been exploiting that niche, eating higher up vegetation before the big sauropodomorphs really got going in that direction.
It's definitely possible. It suggests the ecology of Triassic herbivores was more complex, with different Archosauromorph groups experimenting with similar lifestyles earlier than we previously thought. They might have even been competing with other big plant eaters around at the time, like the Dicynodonts.
Fascinating. So Azendosaurus wasn't just an evolutionary oddity, it might have been an ecological pioneer. Okay, let's think about its daily life, its paleobiology. What can we infer about its diet from those teeth and jaws?
Well, the leaf-shaped teeth clearly point to herbivory, and we have some direct evidence from tooth microwear piney scratches on the tooth surface.
Oh, cool. Where did that show?
Analysis on A. madagascarensis teeth suggests it was eating relatively soft but still firm plants, not super tough or gritty stuff. And the wear patterns indicate a simple up and down jaw motion, not the complex chewing you see in, say, ornithischian dinosaurs or contemporary cynodonts.
Simpler chewing for softer plants. Makes sense. Do we have that for the Moroccan species too?
Unfortunately, no microwear data for A. laroussii yet. Hopefully one day.
And those palatal teeth, were they helping with this simple chewing?
Very likely. Their shape, so similar to the main teeth, strongly suggests they were actively involved in breaking down food. And remember how younger individuals had fewer and smaller ones?
Yeah.
That suggests the whole dental battery became more powerful as the animal grew, probably allowing it to process more food, or maybe tougher food as it got bigger.
A dental system that ramped up with age. Cool. And its posture, that mix of sprawling back legs and a more upright front, how did that affect feeding?
Well, that semi-sprawled stance, but with the front end likely raised a bit because of the shoulder structure, plus the long neck and small head, it probably allowed Azendosaurus to browse higher than many of its low-slung contemporaries.
Giving it access to different food sources.
Potentially, yeah. Reaching foliage others couldn't. This might be another driver for that convergence with sauropodomorphs, both groups evolving ways to reach higher, although Azendosaurus did it with a more mixed posture, not the fully upright stance of sauropods. The sprawling back legs probably limited how high it could ultimately reach compared to them.
A sort of medium-high browser for its time, perhaps? What about its metabolism? Could it have been warm-blooded?
This is really interesting. A study looked at the microstructure of limb bones thought to belong to A. larousi. They found densely packed blood vessels and a type of bone tissue called fibrolamellar bone, which is typically associated with fast growth rates and high resting metabolic rates, similar to modern birds and mammals.
Seriously. Warm-bloodedness.
It strongly suggests a high metabolism, maybe even endothermy, yeah. Which is fascinating because it contrasts with slower growth inferred for some relatives like Triassic. It hints that maybe high metabolic rates evolved earlier in the Archosaur lineage than we sometimes assume.
Wow, a potentially warm-blooded, semi-sprawling, high-browsing reptile with digging claws and extra teeth. What a creature. Okay, let's zoom out to its world. The paleoecology of Morocco and Madagascar back then.
Right. Key thing to remember is during the Middle to Late Triassic, these places were connected, part of the supercontinent Pangaea. So you'd expect some overlap in the kinds of animals living there, even though the specific environments might differ slightly. The overall climate was generally hot, maybe semi-arid, but with wetter periods.
Okay, starting with Morocco. The Timus-Gadouin Formation, where A. larousi was found. What was that like?
The specific layers it comes from, the T5 member, seem to represent a fairly broad, semi-humid basin. Think permanent brackish lakes, sandbars, meandering rivers flowing across a muddy floodplain, a bit wetter than the preceding period.
And who else lived there?
A real Triassic menagerie. You had phytosaurs like Arganarhynus, looked a bit like crocs, big predators like the Rowisuchid Argonausuchus, smaller guys like the Silesaurid Diodorus, armored atosaurs, little early reptile relatives called Procolophants.
Wow.
Plus a Dicynodont, one of those mammal relatives called Mongraberia, and various amphibians and fish. We also find lots of fossil footprints, some from big animals we haven't even found bones for yet.
A busy place.
Yeah.
Now, over to Madagascar, the Mackay Formation, home of A. madagascarensis. What was its neighborhood like?
Also pretty diverse. Azendosaurus shared its space with rhynchosaurs like Isolorhynchus, another type of herbivorous reptile. There were various cynodonts, some plant eaters like Datodon, some predators like Ctenichodon. Also, an undescribed Dicynodont, an early relative of Tuataras, another Procolophonid, a tiny little dinosauromorph called Congonophon, other early dinosaur relatives still waiting for names, and another mysterious Archosaur.
Quite the cast of characters. Is the timing well understood there?
It's still debated a bit. Middle Triassic Ladinian or maybe early late Triassic Carnian. We mostly figure it out by comparing the whole fauna to other places.
Got it. And any clues about habitat preference?
Interestingly, all the A. madagascarensis fossils come from this fine-grained red mudstone.
Yeah.
That might hint it preferred certain habitats or maybe had specific behaviors that led to preservation there. We don't know for sure.
And diet overlap. Did it compete with the cynodonts?
There's some thought, based on tooth wear differences between Azendosaurus and the cynodont Datodon, that they might have partitioned resources slightly. Maybe Azendosaurus, with its simpler teeth and higher reach, focused more on softer leaves, while Datodon tackled different stuff.
Makes sense. Niche partitioning even way back then. One last thing, any signs of injuries or diseases on these bones? Any paleopathology?
Actually, yes, one case. Adon madagascarensis. A single specimen had a messed up interclavicle, that chest bone.
What was wrong with it?
The long part that projects backward was sharply bent, a malformation. It's just one bone, but it's a little glimpse into the physical challenges these animals faced.
Fascinating. Okay, let's wrap this up. We've covered a lot of ground on this strange reptile. What are the main takeaways from our deep dive into Azendosaurus?
Well, the biggest thing I think is that it wasn't a dinosaur, despite looking like one in some ways. It's a fantastic example of convergent evolution developing features like those seen in sauropodomorphs totally independently.
Right.
Its discovery and figuring out where it fits with other allocodosaurs has really opened our eyes to just how diverse herbivorous archosauromorphs were much earlier than we thought, and the different ways they made a living in the Triassic.
And none of this would be clear without those incredible Madagascar finds, right? They completely changed the picture from those first few jaw fragments.
Absolutely crucial. Going from those scraps to nearly complete skeletons of A. madagascarensis was what allowed us to finally understand its true identity, not a dinosaur, but this really interesting, more basal archosauromorph, a key player in this whole Allochodosauria group.
It's a great story of scientific discovery.
Yeah.
So here's a final thought for you, our listeners, to consider. We've seen this remarkable convergence between Azendosaurus and sauropods. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other adaptations we see in the fossil record, things we might think are unique to one group, could have actually popped up independently in totally different lineages?
Yeah, and what does that tell us about how evolution works? How predictable or unpredictable are the solutions it finds when animals face similar environmental pressures, even millions of years apart?
Definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.